Hi everyone, this video looks at session 17 where we were covering the relationship between employment and wages and specifically thinking about how this all affects the aggregate supply curve. The session actually goes beyond just the aggregate supply curve though, because what it's really looking at is trying to show the linkages between aggregate demand and aggregate supply and the Phillips curve, but making very explicit the route via which those changes happen, which is through the labor market with respect to wages and employment. So I'm going to be using some diagrams to make it clear, hopefully. But before we do that, I want to draw your attention to some of the key things which you need to remember before we look at the diagrams. The other thing just to note is that the diagrammatical discussion is actually not that different to what we would have covered when we looked at the inflation-augmented Phillips curve. The only addition is that we're drawing out a very specific relationship that is going on, which is the relationship between wages and employment. Okay, so the first thing to remember in terms of the linkages between output, employment, and wages, etc., is Oken's law. Now, Oken's law is a very specific relationship that looks at how output is affected or related to the unemployment rate. By definition, Oken's law says that 1 extra percentage point of unemployment costs 2% of GDP. What does that mean? Well, it means that when the unemployment rate in the economy is rising, each time it rises by 1 percentage point, we can be expecting that GDP is falling by 2%. In other words, there is a cost to the economy of rising rates of unemployment, and namely, that is falling rates of GDP growth. This equation we picked up on in one of the earlier lectures, and what it's suggesting here is that as the actual rate of unemployment rises above the natural rate, that would be associated with decreases in the amount of output being produced. Output would fall below the potential level of output. The next link to make clear is that changes in the wage rates in the economy directly impact upon prices, and that's what this equation is hoping to do. What it's suggesting is that the price that firms charge per unit of output produced is directly linked to the wage that they have to pay workers for producing that output. P stands for the price level, Z or Z stands for the markup, W stands for the wage rate, and A stands for the quantity of output that is being produced. Intuitively, what you should hopefully be able to recognize is that what this is suggesting is that the price that firms charge for the output that they're producing depends on the average cost of producing the output along with whatever additional markup the firm wants to make. To use an example, if the wage was equal to 100, Z or Z, the markup was equal to 10%, and if the quantity of output produced was 11, then the price that the firm would be charging for the output, given those variables or those values, would be equal to 10. Okay, and all I've done is substitute in the value for the wage, the value for the markup, and the value for the output. When the wage increases, that's going to have a direct impact on the price. So for a given markup and for a given amount of output being produced, if the wage increased from 100, which is what it was before, to 220, then the price will need to increase from 10 up to 22. So what we can see here is the direct relationship between wages and prices in the economy. As wages rise, prices rise, and as wages fall, prices would fall. The next relationship to just bear in mind is the Phillips curve relationship. So this Phillips curve relationship refers specifically to the inflation-augmented Phillips curve, the inflation expectations-augmented Phillips curve. And here what this shows is that the rate of growth in wages depends, or the rate of growth in wage inflation is dependent on inflationary expectations, what do we think is going to happen to inflation in the future, as well as any deviation of the unemployment rate from the natural rate of unemployment. And then what we are going to explicitly just look at later on, but I'm going to tell you what it is now, is the aggregate supply curve equation. We did mention the aggregate supply curve equation in one of the earlier sessions, but just to remind you, of what it is showing that the price level in the future is going to depend on the expectations of price increases in the future, as well as deviations in the level of output from the full employment level of output. Okay. With those three things in mind, let's just try and then make clear the wage-employment relationship, or the link between wages and prices and employment, and how it all features or factors into each other. So I have put here, hopefully I can get it all on the screen at once. Yeah, that looks right. What I have drawn in is 3 sets of axes and 3 diagrams. Diagram 1 is the standard aggregate demand and aggregate supply curve diagram. Equilibrium is where aggregate demand equals aggregate supply, and it allows us to establish the equilibrium price level and the equilibrium level of outputs. Moving to the bottom one, because it's the familiar one, we have the short-run Phillips curve. Remember, the short-run Phillips curve shows the relationship between unemployment rates and inflation, typically wage inflation in the economy, and it is inversely sloped because of the trade-off that typically exists between wage inflation and the rate of unemployment. Typically, the higher the rate of wage inflation, the lower the unemployment rate, and the lower the rate of wage inflation, the higher the unemployment rate. The diagram, which we haven't explicitly looked at before, but which is relatively simple to understand, is tracking the relationship between employment, the frequency of employment, the number of people who are employed, and the wage rate that those people get paid. It's a positive relationship because more people are willing to supply their labor to the market, the higher the wage rate is, and therefore as the wage rate increases, it becomes easier for firms to employ people because there's more people supplying their labor to the market, and so the employment rate increases, or the number of people employed will increase. So the way to think about this is that there's a positive relationship between wages and employment. As the wage rate increases, the number of people who would want to work increases. What you should note is that on all 3 diagrams, I have marked off point A. And the reason why it's labeled point A on all 3 diagrams is because these are measuring the existing state of affairs in an economy at a particular point in time. So point A on the Phillips curve is suggesting that prices in this economy are P star A and output in this economy is Y star A. When prices are P star A, wages are Y star A, and the level of output, Y star A, is associated with a level of employment, N star A. So when in this economy output is produced at that price level, N star A is the number of people who are employed, and that is the wage that those people are receiving. The Phillips curve then also coincides with these equilibriums in the economy, and what the Phillips curve is suggesting, it's the only graph where what we're dealing with is percentages rather than levels. What it's suggesting is that when the price level is P star A and the wage level is W star A, there is inflation in the economy equal to pi A. And I've suggested that we can think about inflation of being, say, 5%. In addition, on the horizontal axis, what it is suggesting is that when the economy is producing output of Y star A, and N star A is the number of people who are employed, the people who don't have jobs, the unemployed, is, and we can work out the unemployment rate, that unemployment rate is U star A. So the stars here refer to kind of full employment levels of the measures. So this is the price level at full employment, that's the output level at full employment, that's the wage rate at full employment, that's the number of people employed at full employment. This is the inflation rate. You can also think about that as the inflation rate at full employment, and this is the natural rate of unemployment. Alright, to think about then how we can use these diagrams and then explicitly make the links between them, let's think about what would happen in this economy if the demand for goods and services increased. The first thing to bear in mind is that people would be having an existing expected rate of inflation, which is based on the existing inflation rate. So what we're going to do is almost shock the system by assuming that demand for goods and services increases, but that demand for goods and services wasn't expected. So when the demand for goods and services increases, we show that as a rightward shift of the demand curve. And when the demand for goods and services increases, what we can see is that there would be excess demand in the economy, and that excess demand in the economy would cause firms to start wanting to expand the amount of output that they are producing. And as firms expand the amount of output that they're producing, they're going to need to hire more workers. So on this wage-employment relationship, the expansion in the demand for goods and services and the excess demand, which starts to put upward pressure on prices, part of the reason why there is upward pressure on prices is that for firms to expand production, they're going to need to hire more workers. And when they hire more workers, they're going to need to offer those workers a higher wage. So one of the ways to think about this is that if you start from a point of full employment, the only way to get more out of your existing workers would be to pay them overtime, for example. That kind of places upward pressure on wages. Or if there were people who were not previously employed when at the going wage rate of W star A, they weren't willing to supply their labor at that wage rate. The only reason or way to get them into the labor market is to offer them a wage in excess of what the previous market clearing wage was. So when there is an increase in the demand for goods and services and prices and output starts to rise, we can show that also on the wage-employment relationship. And we can see that wages rise and employment rises. Okay? The next thing to note is that, and I've put it in here on the right-hand side, is this link between wages and prices comes from the kind of markup behavior that firms undertake. When there's upward pressure on wages, there is upward pressure on prices. Okay? What we then do is we translate what's going on aggregate demand and aggregate supply to the Phillips curve relationship. And what happens is, because when the demand for goods and services increases, I've said that this was an unexpected increase in the demand for goods and services. When the demand for goods and services increases and prices rise and wages rise, that puts upward pressure on the rate of increase in wage inflation and in inflation more generally. So we show that as an upward movement along the Phillips curve, and we can draw in or mark off what the higher rate of inflation is. Let's just say that that rate of inflation is now 7%, say. And also what we can explicitly recognize, and this is where the Okun's law equation becomes important, is that as output levels increased, unemployment rates dropped. Okay? So as the level of output increased beyond the potential level of output, the unemployment rate would fall below the natural rate. So in terms of Okun's law, what we're suggesting here is that there has been a decrease in the unemployment rates, and that should then have a positive effect on output and GDP growth, which is what we're showing on the horizontal axis of the aggregate demand curve and aggregate supply curve diagram. Okay, so that's quite a lot going on, so I'll quickly recap. Starting from a point of equilibrium, there is an increase in the demand for goods and services. Excess demand puts upward pressure on prices, because in order for firms to be able to expand production, employment needs to increase. Employment can only increase if wages increase, and when wages increase, that directly affects the price level in the economy. In addition, this upward pressure on prices and wages affects the inflation rate. Inflation rate starts rising above the previously anticipated level of inflation. And in addition, what we have is the unemployment rate falling below the natural rate of unemployment. So the final thing for me to do here is to just label that the unemployment rate falls below the natural rate. Okay. We now need to build in the inflationary expectations explicitly, because if people start to experience the higher level of inflation, they are not going to keep their inflation expectations at the lower level of inflation. They're going to think, okay, in future, we've now experienced this higher level of inflation, we must adjust our inflationary expectations upwards. When they do that, the adjustment of inflationary expectations upwards means that this is going to again have a direct impact on firms' costs of production. When people think that inflation is going to be higher than what it was previously, when they go into wage negotiations with their employers, they're no longer going to bargain for a low wage increase. They're going to bargain for a wage increase in line with the higher rate of inflation which they have experienced, and with therefore the higher inflationary expectations which they have in mind. This causes firms' costs of production to increase. When firms' costs of production increase, we show an increase in firms' costs of production as a leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. So maybe I should just do that. And when firms' costs of production rise, that is effectively, firms will then respond by going, we're not able to produce as much anymore. That's why the aggregate supply curve shifts leftwards. The effect of this on the economy is as follows. What we can see is that the price level will be higher than before, but the equilibrium level of output will return to the full employment level of output. How do we show what's going on the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model diagram? Well, what we have to recognize is that the adjustment from AS1 to, this should have been AS2, is caused by people's inflationary expectations increasing and by firms' costs of production increasing. Firms' costs of production go up because if people are bargaining for higher wage increases than before, and firms have to agree to these higher wage increases potentially, then the wage rate will be going up. Wages will increase not by 5% but by 7%, the higher amount. So what we can do is we show that on the wage-employment relationship as a leftward shift. And I'm just going to label this 2. The previous one was labeled 1. We show that as a leftward shift of the wage-employment relationship, and what we can explicitly then recognize is the fact that when people bargain for higher wage increases with their employers, that has an effect both on the level of employment and on the wage. As the wage increases, firms are, and because firms' costs of production have gone up and firms have had to cut back on the amounts of output that they're producing, they're no longer going to be able to hire the additional workers because that they would have hired previously, and they're no longer going to be able to pay overtime because they are now having to pay their entire workforce a higher wage than before. So wages go up, and the level of employment returns to the original level of employment. Here, the level of output returns to the original level of output. As we would have done previously, we need to show how this affects the Phillips curve diagram. And what we then show is that this is a rightward shift of the short-run Phillips curve. Okay? And the reason why it's a rightward shift of the short-run Phillips curve is because from point B to point C, that adjustment was caused by people's inflationary expectations rising. Instead of expecting inflation of 5%, they were expecting inflation of 7%. This caused firms' costs of production to rise. As firms' costs of production rose, firms cut back on the amount that they were willing to supply, and that meant that when they cut back on the amount that they were willing to supply, output fell back to the original level of output. Prices went up though, because firms' costs of production went up, because they had to pay their existing workforce a higher wage. Output has fallen back to the original level of output, and employment falls back to the original level of output. On the Phillips curve, we illustrate this as a rightward shift of the Phillips curve, indicating that at point C, we're back to the natural rate of unemployment and back to the full employment level of production and output, but that from point B to point C, the economy and people have now factored in the higher rate of inflationary expectations. Alright, so the thing then to just note is that this discussion is no different to the inflation expectations augmented Phillips curve discussion that we would have gone through in an earlier session. The only thing which we have done here is make explicit that also what happens is a change in wages and employment, and we've made explicit how that works using the wage-employment relationship diagram. Finally, then, just to note, is that this aggregate supply curve, remember I said to you that the aggregate supply curve equation is as follows, PET plus 1 plus lambda y minus y star. Okay, and what this is suggesting, so as we move from point B to point B to C, for example, is that the price increase that is experienced is directly related to our expectations of price increases and the amount by which the actual level of output deviates from the full employment level of output. Here, the actual rate of output exceeded the potential level of output. That affected our inflationary expectations, and then going forward, we adjusted our inflationary expectations and that then ensured that as we move from point B to point C, the level of output was able to return to the full employment level of output. Inflation that then happens is then purely as a result of inflationary expectations.